Today is October 30th, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, as well as the widening conflict in the Middle East. Let's start with Ukraine. Let's start by looking at the map, liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian map, so please keep that in mind as we look at it. And as we look at it, well, we can tell, and if you've been looking at it over the last several days or even weeks, Ukraine's offensive is over. And they even announced that, and I'll get to that in just a moment. And all of the fighting is centered around Avdiivka, outside of Donetsk city. You can see the salient that is developing, the encirclement that Russia is working on to encircle and cut off Avdiivka, the main supply line. You can see how dangerously close Russian forces are to overrunning it. And this really is a very small distance between the two pincers of Russian forces. You can use this as a reference, 2 kilometers. That is 2 kilometers. This is less than 10 kilometers. And of course, there's fighting all along the line of contact in the Donbas region. Russian forces had been, the initiative had shifted over to Russian forces even during the Ukrainian offensive in the south and around Bakhmut. And of course, we see no pushes from Ukraine around Bakhmut either. It appears that they are intent on holding the line. And I heard that Ukraine announced the end of their offensive, although they didn't quite phrase it like that. This is from SIPA. SIPA is the Center for European Policy Analysis. It is funded by the US government, the arms industry, the US arms industry, and their article dated October 23rd, 2023, Ukraine draws breath after southern success. Ukraine is entering a new phase in its southern counteroffensive. Meanwhile, it needs more Western arms as a matter of urgency. So what is this new phase that they've entered? The operational pause, which is just their way of saying the offensive is over. It has demonstrably failed. The article says, Ukraine's counteroffensive is now limited to minimal attempts to move forward in the center of gravity near Robotne after almost 5 months, and most recently, only very laborious advances on foot. The troops are exhausted. Ukraine is taking an operational pause on this section of the front and overall is currently redeploying its troops and resources, in part out of caution given the current US budget impasse on further Ukrainian aid. But also, as it'll mention later, Russia has meanwhile launched massive attacks at Avdiivka from both the northwest and southwest, with the biggest attack in months. Russia apparently wants to regain the initiative at all costs and ideally get its hands on an urban area for wintering its troops, which is just utterly absurd. Again, this is right outside Donetsk city. And what is clear is that the initiative has already long since passed to Russia. They're redeploying their troops from the south so that they can try to stop the inevitable encirclement and taking of Avdiivka by Russian forces. It also talks about attack of missiles. They try to claim that this is going to make some sort of impact. We already see that it hasn't. They also talk about strikes in Crimea by Ukrainian drones and missiles, allowing Ukrainian grain ships to pass through the Black Sea. Now, myself and Mark Sloboda, who I've had on my channel, have talked about the situation in the Black Sea. Russia could, if they wanted to, sink every single one of those ships. They have submarines operating in the Black Sea, but they don't want to escalate. They're playing a very delicate balancing act between inflicting high costs on Ukraine without internationalizing the conflict any further than it already is. The article also admits Russian air superiority along the front line remains a key problem. Russia conducts airstrikes and drone attacks near the front line every day, while Ukraine struggles to engage the planes and helicopters directly. Russia is also increasingly using cheaply converted glide bombs guided by GLONASS satellite navigation. Lancet kamikaze drones and GLONASS refitted glide bombs are becoming cheap tools of choice for Russia across the front. And so they're even admitting, this US government-funded think tank is admitting that Russia has the advantage. They have the advantage in terms of manpower, equipment, ammunition. They have this advantage given to them by their extensive use of military aviation. Use of military aviation that is expanding as the conflict goes on, both because of Russia's ability to grind down Ukrainian air defenses, and also their industrial output gearing up to just put more equipment and more munitions out there on the battlefield. So this SIPA article, Ukraine draws breath after Southern success, even in the article, if you read it from start to finish, contradicts the initial claims they're trying to make in Ukraine's favor. And it gets worse for Ukraine. We have articles like this from Bloomberg. EU is falling short on pledge to supply Ukraine with ammunition. Kiev had been promised 1 million artillery rounds by March of next year. The US has urged EU to ramp up its effort to supply Ukraine. And I have talked about this endlessly on and on for months before the offensive even began, the Ukrainian offensive began. The article says the European Union is falling behind on plans to provide Ukraine with 1 million artillery shells by March. People familiar with the matter said potentially giving Russian forces an advantage in the supply of ammunition. Clearly, they've always had the advantage. This gives them a further advantage. Under plans made earlier this year, the EU pledged to provide the artillery ammunition rounds to Ukraine over a 12-month period by first dipping into existing stocks, which I guess are now depleted, and then through joint procurement contracts and increasing industrial capacity, which, as I've explained, could take months or even years to do. And that depends on how serious Europe is to doing this in the first place. With more than half of the time gone now, the initiative has so far delivered about 30% of the target, and based on the volume of contracts signed to date, risks missing its goal. According to people and documents seen by Bloomberg News, several member states have privately asked the bloc's foreign policy arm to extend their deadline. The people added, so you're going to extend the deadline. You're not going to be able to increase output. You're going to extend the deadline so you just have more time to gather this ammunition together. And that 30% that they have already delivered to Ukraine was delivered simply because it already existed in their stockpiles. This is a problem they cannot solve. You could just tell by reading these type of articles and listening to European politicians speak. They have no genuine interest in solving this. The population has no resolve to solve this. They have no interest, and it doesn't serve their interests to do so. And I've covered how the New York Times has admitted Russia is already producing over 2 million rounds a year. That is more than the US and Europe combined, even after they expand, if they expand their artillery production and reach the targets that they've set out. Last year, the US and Europe benefited from their stockpiles. This coming year, they will be depending on their monthly output, which is not much. And this is going to take an already desperate situation for Ukraine and make it even worse. Don't forget that in addition to this shell hunger that the West has no ability to solve, now that we see tensions rising in the Middle East, we see Israel carrying out this extensive military operation against Gaza. They have already begun, the US has already begun diverting shells that were destined for Ukraine to Israel. So it'll make a bad and deteriorating situation even worse yet. Now let's talk about the Middle East. Let's talk first about the ongoing military operations carried out by Israel against Gaza. Let's take a look at this Reuters article. Israel pounds Gaza's north as it steps up ground assault. Palestinians in northern Gaza reported fierce air and artillery strikes as Israeli troops backed by tanks pressed into the enclave with a ground assault that drew increased international calls for the protection of civilians. Israeli airstrikes hit areas near Gaza City's Shifa and Al-Quds hospitals, and Palestinian militants clashed with Israeli forces in a border area east of the city of Khan Yunis. in the enclave south, Palestinian media reported. Let's take a look at the live UA map for Israel and its operations in Gaza. Again, this is a very pro-Western website, and all of these maps are going to reflect pro-Western points of view. Khan Yunis, that I just mentioned from the article, is here in southern Gaza, but Israel's focusing on and attempting to isolate northern Gaza. As you can see, that includes Gaza City, and then there's an area with a smaller density of urban sprawl here. And this is where in 2008-2009 Israeli ground forces penetrated and used to cut off Gaza City. And then from there, they actually made extensive incursions into Gaza City itself before calling off the operation. If Israel is serious about isolating, storming, and clearing northern Gaza, they will have to enter in through here to cut northern Gaza off from the rest of the Gaza Strip. And they're already pressing and pushing into Gaza through the north. And here in the east, the last bit is to close the trap here, and then they will work on Gaza City and the surrounding areas. The article continues. The bombardments came hours after Israel released images of battle tanks on the Palestinian enclave's western coast, signaling a potential effort to surround Gaza's main city 2 days after the Israeli government ordered expanded ground incursions across its eastern border. Israel's self-declared second phase of a 3-week war against Iranian-backed Hamas militants. I take issue with that. There is no evidence that Iran is the principal sponsor of Hamas, and they have provided no evidence, and the US government itself admits there was no evidence that Iran had anything to do with Hamas's October 7th raid. This is the Western media, which includes Reuters. This is the Western media attempting to link Iran with what happened on October 7th to create a pretext for wider US military operations in the region. I'm going to talk about that, but you could see how they're working that into the narrative very dishonestly and completely without evidence. As a matter of fact, in contradiction to existing evidence, even the Western media has presented. They're talking about how this second phase is being kept from public view, with forces moving under darkness and a telecommunications blackout cutting off Palestinians. Phone and internet cuts appear to have eased on Sunday, but telecoms provider Paltel said that Israeli airstrikes again had knocked out internet and phone services in parts of the enclave's northern sections, where Hamas has command centers. The outages have severely hampered rescue operations for casualties of Israeli barrages. Hamas and any other militant organization anywhere around the world will have the ability to communicate no matter what Israel tries to do. This is to prevent journalists and activists from showing the world what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people in Gaza. That is what this is about. It's about burying the people of Gaza alive in darkness, both literally and also metaphorically, in terms of telecommunications and media. Now, the vast majority of the planet is calling for a ceasefire. They want humanitarian aid to reach the people of Gaza immediately, and they want Israel to sit down at the negotiation table and begin the process of finally implementing the two-state solution. That is what is prescribed by international law. That is Israel's obligation under international law, and everything else that they're doing is in violation of international law. They are illegally occupying Palestinian territory. I've talked about UN resolutions spelling that out in detail. And while people continuously tell me Israel has the right to defend themselves, they have the right to defend themselves within their internationally recognized borders. They do not have the right to defend themselves in terms of their illegal occupation. And now this becomes a gray area because Hamas raids on October 7th targeted Israeli military targets, which was legitimate. Under international law, the Palestinian people have the right to resist illegal occupation, but then they also had to target civilians, non-combatants, and that's where they crossed the line, and that's where they gave Israel a pretext to carry out an operation like this, however disproportionate and disingenuous their claims to self-defense may be. Now, this military operation that Israel claims it's preparing, this ground incursion into Gaza, in the past, they have stormed into Gaza. In 2008, 2009, they stormed into Gaza quickly. They cut off northern Gaza. They stormed into Gaza City. And after fighting and taking casualties, they ended the operation. In 2014, they didn't even do that much. They were fighting all along the edge of Gaza, east of Gaza City and to the north. They never made the commitment to try to cut off Gaza City entirely from the rest of the Strip. They began taking heavy casualties. They were leveling entire neighborhoods, and then they called off the operation. And I suspect in both cases, it was a combination of both political and logistic limits that they were reaching. Israel has the military power to encircle northern Gaza, to enter in and clear it of Hamas. They could do that. The question is, do they want to pay the price in terms of manpower and equipment? Obviously, the political and diplomatic price of essentially leveling the rest of Gaza, northern Gaza, as they do that. And also putting themselves in a place of extreme vulnerability, both during the operation and immediately after. Their military forces will be depleted. They will need to be reconstituted. And there will be a window of opportunity there for Israel's adversaries to attack. And that might be why the US military is building up a significant presence in the region. That may be one explanation. There could be other explanations. I will get into that in just a bit. I talked about in a previous update that 65% of Israelis polled, this was about a week ago, were in favor of a ground operation. And I pointed out how that is a majority, but it's not an overwhelming majority. And we have this article here from The Guardian. Israelis hesitant over Gaza ground invasion amid hostage fears, polls show. Only 29% of those surveyed back an immediate offensive, while 49% said it would be better to wait. And they actually do talk about the 65% that backed a ground offensive in a previous poll. That was on October 19th, to be exact. And as Israel begins suffering casualties, and as these horrific sights and sounds continue to emerge from Gaza, there will be certain sections of the Israeli public who will increasingly be resistant to continued military operations. So that is one clock that will be ticking for Israeli forces. The other clock that will be ticking is their military power, the amount of ammunition, the number of tanks that they have. If they begin suffering heavy losses, they have realistic limitations in that sense. And also in terms of ammunition levels. In 2006, their incursion into southern Lebanon, they actually had to ask for additional precision-guided air munitions be expedited to Israel from the United States because they were running out. That provided a limitation to how long Israel could conduct that incursion, and ultimately they had to call it off, and it was a failure. Alexander Mikuris of the Duran has been pointing out how vulnerable Israel's economy might be in the face of a long-term, large-scale military operation. It is a small country. 300,000 reservists will no longer be doing whatever it was they were doing for the Israeli economy. They'll be waiting for combat, standing by for combat. How long can Israel afford to do that without incurring significant, even irreversible damage? So even though Israel has the military power to carry out this operation, they will be cutting it very close, and it will be a very delicate balancing act, politically, economically, logistically, militarily. We see Israel conducting what could be a more limited, or I would say more methodical operation. Rather than storming into northern Gaza, they appear to be pushing incrementally in around the edges. And that type of approach might actually be more beneficial for Israel. From Israel's point of view, if they can weather the political chaos domestically and internationally of leveling Gaza, killing thousands and thousands of civilians, they could logistically, technically, continue this type of operation for much longer. What limited resources the U.S. does have available, considering their ongoing proxy war in Ukraine as well, might be enough for Israel to continue these types of operations. You have to remember that while Israel has limitations to what it can do militarily, so does Hamas and other militant groups in Gaza, especially if they are cut off from the rest of Gaza and the borders with Egypt. How long will their supplies last? Their fuel, their ammunition, their medical supplies? If Israel cuts northern Gaza off and continues this type of incremental advance, it will be very similar to what happened with the US in terms of Fallujah. The fall of Fallujah was inevitable. It was just a matter of time. They were completely cut off. They could not sustain combat operations indefinitely, while the US, for all intents and purposes, could. Based on the information I have available to me at this time, that is what it looks like Israel is looking at in terms of options. And the US may be building up its military in the region specifically to provide them both impunity for what they are doing to Gaza and also military cover, because Israel will be cutting it close and they will be in a state of vulnerability during and after this military operation, however long it takes. However, there's another possibility that all of this is a pretext for the US to escalate the conflict across the entire region and then enter the conflict itself directly. And the United States is already carrying out strikes. CNN, US strikes 2 facilities linked to Iranian-backed militias in Syria following series of attacks on US forces in Middle East. This was October 27, 2023. The U.S. assessed that the airstrikes against the facilities linked to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups did not result in any casualties, according to a Friday statement from Brigadier General Pat Ryder, the Pentagon press secretary. The strikes, carried out by an F-15 fighter jet and a pair of F-16 fighter jets using precision-guided munitions, targeted a weapons and ammunition storage facility in Abu Kamal near the border between Syria and Iraq. The strikes destroyed the facilities, according to Ryder, and this border area has been struck repeatedly by both the U.S. and Israel over years. This is an ongoing process. The U.S. claims that it's in Syria to fight Al-Qaeda and ISIS, while in reality they provide ISIS and Al-Qaeda cover. They supply them, they arm them, and they actually are striking at the forces in the region who are genuinely fighting and also defeating ISIS and Al-Qaeda. The U.S. government admits that there is no evidence Iran was involved in the October 7th Hamas raids. They admit that there's no evidence at all, and yet they're still posturing themselves to use the raids as a pretext to target Iran specifically. And we remember the U.S. doing the exact same thing in the wake of the September 11, 2001 attacks in New York and in Washington. There was a plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. We remember how they were blaming Al-Qaeda for this, but then they were also linking everyone else on their long list of countries they wanted to invade, had always wanted to invade, including Iraq. And while the US government officially denied Iraq had any role at all whatsoever in 9/11, they still attempted to insinuate Iraq was somehow involved, and they postured themselves in a way that used 9/11 as a pretext to invade Iraq. It was also this false fabricated claims of weapons of mass destruction, but there was also that element. For people who lived through it, who remember, they will remember that very distinctively. So here is an article from Reuters. This was from October 24th, 2023. Blinken tells UN, US doesn't want war with Iran, but will defend itself. Well, I will tell you that the US desperately wants war with Iran, and I will get into that. I will get into US government-funded policy papers that admit how desperately the U.S. seeks war with Iran. But this is what Reuters says about U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's statements. Blinken spoke to the 15-member UN Security Council amid international fears the conflict between Israel and Iran-backed Palestinian Hamas militants in Gaza Strip could spill over into wider war. There you have this Iran-backed Palestinian Hamas militants. They did it again. They did it again. It could spill over into a wider war, drawing in Lebanon's heavily armed Hezbollah that is also supported by Tehran. And what Reuters deliberately omits is the fact that Hamas and Hezbollah are more or less opposed to one another. They had actually been fighting in Syria because Hamas joined the US-backed militants during the US proxy war on Syria for years and years. They were fighting on the side of both the US and Israel because Israel was also a participant in the proxy war against Syria. The United States does not seek conflict with Iran. We do not want this war to widen. But if Iran or its proxies attack U.S. personnel anywhere, make no mistake, we will defend our people. We will defend our security swiftly and decisively. The U.S. military is taking new steps to protect its troops in the Middle East as concerns mount about attacks by Iran-backed groups, officials tell Reuters. The U.S. has also sent warships and fighter aircraft to the region to try to deter Iran and Iran-backed groups, including 2 aircraft carriers. This might be a good time to remind people why the U.S. is involved in the Middle East at all in the first place. Thousands and thousands of miles from their own shores. Why in the Middle East they give Israel, just like they give Ukraine, a blank check to do as they please domestically and across their internationally recognized borders, and why the U.S. might be attempting to use this crisis as a possible opportunity to strike at Iran. The U.S. is in the Middle East. They seek to control that region just like they seek to control every other region on Earth, whether it's Europe, Asia, Africa, Central and South America. The Middle East is also a vital region. The U.S. has fought wars for decades in an attempt to assert control over. Iran and its allies are a huge obstacle to that. They refuse to be subordinated by the U.S. They refuse to facilitate U.S. foreign policy objectives in the region. As a matter of fact, they're opposed to them and they resist them actively. The U.S. engineered the 2011 Arab Spring to reorder the entire region into a united front against Iran. The Arab Spring, which began as political protests, but also there were armed elements of violence, just like during the Euromaidan in Ukraine in 2014, that evolved into a series of conflicts in which the U.S. intervened militarily. In Libya in 2011 and also in Syria. The U.S. is still occupying eastern Syria illegally. They have no basis under international law whatsoever to be in Syria right now. So when U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the U.S. is protecting themselves, they have the right to self-defense, they're talking about their illegal military occupation of another country. Under international law, armed groups have every right to attack and attempt to expel these U.S. troops. They have no right at all whatsoever to be there. So the U.S. stirred up the entire region, North Africa, the Middle East, even Central Asia to an extent. Through the Arab Spring in 2011, it evolved into these armed conflicts. The U.S. spread its military out even further in the region. And remember this, 2011, the Atlantic, the Arab Spring, a virus that will attack Moscow and Beijing. Former presidential candidate and U.S. Senator John McCain, his comments were a biting kicker at an opening dinner of 2011 Halifax International Security Forum. A year ago, Ben Ali and Gaddafi were not in power. Assad won't be in power this time next year. The Arab Spring is a virus that will attack Moscow and Beijing. McCain then walked off the stage. Comparing the Arab Spring to a virus is not new for the senator, but to my knowledge, coupling Russia and China to the comment is Senator McCain's framing reflects a triumphalism bouncing around at this conference. It sees the Arab Spring as a product of Western design and potentially as a tool to take on other non-democratic governments. And of course, the Arab Spring most certainly was a product of Western design. And this is admitted. This is extensively documented. I've spent years documenting this. And we even have admissions from the Western media, including this article from the New York Times. U.S. groups helped nurture Arab uprising. This was April 2011. The Arab Spring was still ongoing. It was transforming into these US-backed proxy wars. And the New York Times says a number of groups and individuals directly involved in the revolts and reforms sweeping the region included the April 6th youth movement in Egypt, the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, and grassroots activists like Ansar Qadi, a youth leader in Yemen, receiving training and financing from groups like the International Republic Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House, a nonprofit human rights organization based in Washington, according to interviews in recent weeks and American diplomatic cables obtained by WikiLeaks. The Republican and Democratic institutes are loosely affiliated with the Republican and Democratic parties. They were created by Congress and are financed through the National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up in 1983 to channel grants for promoting democracy in developing nations. National Endowment receives about $100 million annually from Congress. Freedom House also gets the bulk of its money from the American government, mainly the State Department. I've talked about the NED for many years, how it is the US government's tool of choice for undermining governments around the world, overthrowing them, and building and installing client regimes into power. This New York Times article also talks about training and equipping these, I would call them agitators, as early as 2008. Some Egyptian youth leaders attended a 2008 technology meeting in New York where they were taught to use social networking and mobile technologies to promote democracy. Among those sponsoring the meeting were Facebook, Google, MTV, Columbia Law School, and of course the United States State Department. And that wasn't just a one-off in 2008. The US State Department put these meetings, forums, training sessions together every single year, sometimes multiple sessions in a single year. And this was to prepare all of these agitators from all of these different countries to go back to their respective nations and begin the process of overthrowing their countries. And they created synergies between them because ultimately they are being funded, equipped, and directed by the United States government. So these synergies were able to develop. And we saw that. We saw not just activists in all of these different countries supporting each other, but when the open hostilities began, the US-backed militants began waging war against these battled governments. We saw fighters from, say, Libya transfer over to Syria to help continue this regional reordering perpetuate itself. Now, as the US was engineering this political unrest, it was meant to serve as cover for these militants. That was always a planned part of the so-called Arab Spring, and we know this because we were warned about it by legendary journalist Seymour Hersh. This was his article in the New Yorker all the way back in 2007. It's titled "The Redirection: Is the Administration's New Policy Benefiting Our Enemies in the War on Terrorism?" And he's saying that because he had evidence that the US was arming and backing groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda, also the Muslim Brotherhood, and ultimately these were the armed groups that took over from the political unrest during the Arab Spring and transformed them into these open US proxy wars and open US military interventions. This is what Seymour Hersh had to say in 2007. To undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shia, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shia organization that is backed by Iran. The US has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. The rest of the article talks about the Muslim Brotherhood, both in Egypt and Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood in both Egypt and Syria played a pivotal role once the armed violence began unfolding in both countries, Egypt and Syria. Hamas, as I've explained before, not only was admittedly helped into power by Israel, but it stemmed from the Muslim Brotherhood, which has always been a tool of the US and its allies in the Middle East. And Hamas itself actually turned on the Syrian government during this Arab Spring and the subsequent armed violence. They turned on the Syrian government. They backed the US-sponsored regime change operation, and they even sent fighters to help participate in it. So when you and that meant that Hamas was on the battlefield fighting against Iranian forces, Iranian-backed militias, Hezbollah, the Syrian Arab army, and even Russian forces. That's why people have to be extremely careful now when we see Hamas carry out these attacks against Israel. Yes, the Palestinian people have the right to take up arms and resist occupation by Israel, but if Hamas is not genuinely resisting Israeli occupation, they have been maneuvered into power by Israel itself. The goal is to perpetuate it or to create a pretext for Israel to end it on their terms. You have to be aware of that possibility. And considering everything that has unfolded so far, it really seems like that is the case. But in this case, I will not draw any definitive conclusions. Only time will tell for sure. To this day, I'm talking about the Arab Spring and the subsequent armed interventions. I showed how the US engineered both the political unrest component of the Arab Spring and also the armed militant component. All of that was prepared years in advance. Looking at a map of the Middle East today, we will see that the United States is still illegally occupying Syria. Military forces are still in Iraq, even though the Iraqi government has told them to leave. They refuse to. We also see, however, the Middle East transforming and pivoting away from this order the US has created and is attempting to maintain. We've seen in recent months Saudi Arabia and Iran repairing their ties. We've seen Turkey begin pivoting away from its support for this US proxy war against Syria. We see Turkey and Russia and Syria attempting to repair relations. Syria has been able to reestablish ties across the Arab world. The US had coerced the Arab world to cut Syria off and to participate in this proxy war against Syria. That has now been reversed, and this is because of both Russia and China, their diplomatic efforts in the region. And so there's a closing window of opportunity for the United States to reverse this, to stop it or even reverse it. Of course, they're going to have to do that with conflict, just like Europe before Russia was provoked into launching the special military operation. We saw Germany building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Russia. We saw Germany and the rest of Europe building closer ties with China, interested in possibly joining the Belt and Road Initiative. It was Europe sliding out from under the shadow of US hegemony that had been cast over it since the end of World War II. And how did the US stop and even reverse that? They provoked this war with Russia. They pressured all of Europe to forcefully cut ties with Russia, impose sanctions on Russia. The US literally blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. And now look at where Europe is. They are entirely subordinated to the United States. Their options to even reverse this if they wanted to are limited, as the US has maneuvered all of these political leaders into power, including the European Union bureaucracy as a layer over European sovereignty, to smother any chance at all of Europe ever trying to exit out from under US control again for the foreseeable future. And in Asia, we see the United States doing the same exact thing. They're attempting to coerce governments here in the region to cut their ties with China. Almost every country in this region considers China as their largest, most important trade partner. Many of them are working on major infrastructure projects with China as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the US is doing everything they can to coerce these governments to change attack or undermine and overthrow them so they can install a client regime into power that will, even if it means destroying their economic prospects well into the future. And a good example of this is the Philippines. I will be covering the Philippines in a future video, everything that is transpiring there and how they are destroying themselves and their future by going along with this US-sponsored anti-China campaign and this united front against China that the US is recruiting the Philippines into. So 3 fronts: Ukraine against Russia in Eastern Europe, Israel against Iran and its allies in the Middle East, and the Philippines, also Taiwan against the rest of China in Asia Pacific. And each and every one of these fronts that the US is working on right now to try to reassert control over the planet, to prevent the world from pivoting away from US-led unipolarism to multipolarism. There have been think tanks, US government and industry-funded think tanks that produce policy papers articulating US foreign policy in regards to each one of these fronts. I've talked about the 2019 Rand Corporation paper extending Russia. They spelled out in complete detail everything they planned the US to do to provoke war with Russia, and that is exactly what happened. And the Rand Corporation paper actually even warned that if Russia does decide to commit to a large-scale protracted conflict in Ukraine, it could actually backfire on the US, and it absolutely has. So they paid Rand Corporation all of this money to give them all of their options. Those options came with warnings, and it looks like US decision makers ignored those warnings and went ahead with it anyway. I've talked about Taiwan and the CSIS, another government and industry funded think tank, writing papers about war games. What would happen if China attempted to forcefully reunify Taiwan with the rest of China and the US intervened in a war? And they talk about how the island would be completely destroyed. Industry, infrastructure would be obliterated. The population would be decimated, but they could maintain Taiwan's political independence, which is just a euphemism for maintaining America's political capture over the administration of Taiwan. What about Iran? What about Israel and Iran? Are there any policy papers out there floating around that talked about US plans against Iran? And it turns out, yes, there is. From all the way back in 2009. It's from the Brookings Institution. I've written about this extensively, and I want to talk about it again today. It's available free online as a PDF from the Brookings Institution's website, Which Path to Persia? Options for a New American Strategy Toward Iran. And just to give you an idea of who funds the work of the Brookings Institution, you just go to this 2020 list of the Brookings Institution's contributors and just go down the list and you can see everyone is there. These corporate funded foundations, but also large financial institutions, banks, the arms industry, and the US government through various branches of the US military. So the US government and US corporations are funding the Brookings Institution to create foreign policy. And I say that because if you read the 2009 paper, you can see that everything that they wrote about in that 2009 paper was eventually implemented as US foreign policy in subsequent years. These think tanks are run by Western monopolies. These are monopolies that thrive on perpetual expansion at the expense of everyone else on Earth, essentially. They want to move into every market, and they want to undermine, destroy, and replace truly sovereign nations with client regimes that will open up their markets and allow these monopolies to subordinate them economically. They seek to do this everywhere on Earth, including in the Middle East. And as I've already explained, Iran is a huge obstacle to this process of expanding and subordinating other nations. Now, not only is Iran an obstacle because they've been able to weather decades of US sanctions, of covert regime change attempts, the funding and arming of terrorists inside Iran to destabilize and destroy the political order in Tehran, but also because now they have created huge and very effective conventional military capabilities. They have very significant asymmetrical warfare capabilities, and economically they have been able to sidestep these US sanctions now more than ever by repairing ties with Saudi Arabia. This is something that Duran has pointed out in recent videos. They're also joining BRICS along with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They are maneuvering into a position that will irreversibly put them out of reach of US-sponsored regime change. So there's this closing window of opportunity. Suddenly, this opportunity presents itself. This Hamas October 7th raid and this conflict that Israel is starting with the rest of Gaza, the majority being civilians. This is giving the US one last opportunity to provoke a large-scale conflict in the region. If you read this 2009 paper from Brookings, there's a few things that will really make an impression. Number one, how shameless US policymakers are in describing the use of terrorism, sponsoring, arming and sponsoring and using terrorist groups that are even on US State Department list of terrorist organizations. They're even willing to do that. That is a viable option that they are willing to take pen and put to paper and spell out. They also fully admit that Iran poses no genuine national security threat to the United States. As a matter of fact, as I read through some of the sections of this 170-page policy paper, they will say that even if the US or Israel were to strike Iran in an unprovoked act of military aggression, carrying out large-scale bombing of Iranian military and military facilities and infrastructure across the country, Iran might not even retaliate because they have restraint. They are thinking strategically and diplomatically how bad it'll make the US and Israel look, and that they will serve their purpose better by showing restraint and patience. A nation like that, obviously, then, is not a threat to the US in terms of national security. They admit Iran, we want to provoke Iran, but Iran has never done anything to provoke the United States. So what can we do to try to goad them into a war anyway? So why don't I just start by reading some of the passages out of this paper. Again, the link to this paper will be in the video description below. You can read the whole thing, and I suggest people do. It's essential reading. Absolutely everything that they put into this paper has been subsequently attempted in terms of US foreign policy. So first it says, it would be far more preferable if the United States could cite an Iranian provocation as justification for the airstrikes before launching them, because they were talking about just unilaterally striking Iran to prevent them from possibly developing nuclear weapons. The reason why is not because they're worried Iran will use the nuclear weapons against anyone. It's because they know once they have nuclear weapons, the window of opportunity to use military aggression to overthrow the Iranian government will close forever. That is their only fear. It says, clearly, the more outrageous, the more deadly, and the more unprovoked the Iranian action, the better off the United States would be. Of course, it would be very difficult for the United States to goad Iran into such a provocation without the rest of the world recognizing this game, which would then undermine it. One method that would have some possibility of success would be to ratchet up covert regime change efforts in the hope that Tehran would retaliate overtly or even semi-overtly, which could be then portrayed as an unprovoked act of Iranian aggression. And throughout this entire paragraph, they're admitting that the US establishment regularly lies to both the US public and the global community. They want to portray whatever Iran does in response as an unprovoked act of Iranian aggression when they themselves know they provoked it. In this 2009 paper, they also laid out the whole Iran nuclear deal. They didn't mention it by name, but they were talking about a deal they would propose to Iran, deliberately sabotage, blame it blame its failure on Iran and then use that as a pretext for military aggression. So it says, in a similar vein, any military operation against Iran will likely be very unpopular around the world and require the proper international context, both to ensure the logistical support the operation would require and to minimize the blowback from it. Best way to minimize international opprobrium and maximize support, however grudging or covert, is to strike only when there is a widespread conviction that the Iranians were given but then rejected a superb offer. And they're talking about a widespread conviction, not an understanding of a fact, but the belief in a U.S. fabricated lie. So they say to strike only when there is a widespread conviction that the Iranians were given but then rejected a superb offer, one so good that only a regime determined to acquire nuclear weapons and acquire them for the wrong reasons would turn it down, because for the wrong reasons, they admit in this paper and many other policy papers, including from the Rand Corporation, that if Iran ever did have nuclear weapons, they would be used solely as a deterrent. It says, under those circumstances, the United States or Israel could portray its operations as taken in sorrow, not anger, and at least some in the international community would conclude that the Iranians brought it upon themselves by refusing a very good deal. And we remember, shortly after this paper was published, under the Obama administration, the Iran nuclear deal was proposed. Eventually, it was signed. It was implemented. The Iranians adhered to it. And then under the Trump administration, the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from it, blaming Iran just as the Brookings Institution spelled out. And the Biden administration was supposed to reinstate it. But of course, that was never going to happen because that was not the plan as laid out by the real policymakers of U.S. foreign policy, these unelected, corporate-funded think tanks. These think tanks produce these policy papers. Teams of lawyers craft parts of these policy papers into bills. The bills go with lobbyists to Washington to be rubber stamped. Many people in Washington don't even read them. And then the bill is sent to the corporate media to sell these policies to the public. It's very important to understand how the U.S. really operates, where foreign and domestic policy really stem from, not your elected representatives, unfortunately. The fact that this Brookings Institution ploy to propose, sabotage, unilaterally withdraw from, and then use a deal with Iran as a pretext for military aggression transcended the Obama, Trump, and Biden administration. This demonstrates the continuity of U.S. foreign policy, regardless of who sits in the White House and whoever is running Congress. The actual bombing of Iran and this realization, even in this policy paper, that despite America's greatest efforts to provoke Iran into a conflict, Iran might still refuse to be drawn into one. It says, if the United States were to decide that to garner greater international support, galvanize U.S. domestic support, and or to provide a legal justification for an invasion, it would be best to wait for an Iranian provocation. Then the time frame for an invasion might stretch out indefinitely. And this is actually why the U.S. has not gone to war with Iran yet. They want to cite some sort of Iranian provocation, real or fabricated, and Iran has been very careful not to give them one. It says, with only one real exception, since the 1978 revolution, the Islamic Republic has never willingly provoked an American military response, although it certainly has taken actions that could have done so if Washington had been looking for a fight. Again, throughout this entire policy paper, 170 pages, as a matter of fact, they are admitting that it is the U.S. that seeks conflict with Iran, and not for any genuine national security fear. Then it says, it would not be inevitable that Iran would lash out violently in response to an American air campaign, but no American president should blithely assume that it would not. However, because many Iranian leaders would likely be looking to emerge from the fighting in an advantageous and strategic position as possible, and because they would likely calculate that playing the victim would be their best route to the goal, they might well refrain from such retaliatory missile attacks. So there you have it. They're going to covertly goad Iran into a war. They will essentially look for a way to give Iran no choice but to defend themselves. When they do defend themselves, they will depict it as a unilateral, unprovoked act of Iranian aggression, but they fear that Iran understands this game and would resist retaliating anyway. And then what do? So this gives you insight into the mindset of the people fashioning U.S. foreign policy. And if you've been paying attention to U.S. foreign policy over the last 10, 20, 30 years or more, this will not surprise you at all. This is what you might have imagined U.S. policymakers to be thinking and saying amongst themselves. Well, read the Brookings Institution paper, Which Path to Persia. They are spelling it out in black and white how they think. Reading the 2009 Brookings Institution paper and looking at what's going on in the world today, the crumbling U.S. proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, the fact that China continues to rise, making any sort of U.S. proxy or direct military intervention against China unlikely to succeed. The one place they might feel they still have a chance is the Middle East against Iran. One place, one region they could stop this pivot away from unipolarism toward multipolarism, or even potentially roll it back and reassert U.S. control over a very important region of the world. However, this window of opportunity is closing. This Hamas raid on October 7th was a godsend to them. The Israeli provocation upon the global stage, flattening Gaza, is meant to elicit a very emotional reaction, not just around the world, but especially in the region, and particularly in the streets of, say, Iran, attempting to coerce the governments in the region to respond militarily so the U.S. can finally get the unprovoked military aggression that they have been waiting for to justify their war against Iran and other nations in the region. Now, this paper from 2009 admits that Israel is a viable proxy to possibly provoke Iran into a wider war. And it talks about getting Israel to start a war that the U.S. could then wade into later. This is U.S. policymakers wanting to use Israel as a provocation in place of the U.S. doing it themselves. Then the paper recognizes that Iran has allies in the region and that it would be better to isolate Iran, either win over or eliminate Iran's allies in the region before attempting to trigger this all-out war with Iran itself. It says the Israelis may want to hold off until they have a peace deal with Syria in hand, assuming that Jerusalem believes that one is within reach, which would help them mitigate blowback from Hezbollah and potentially Hamas. Consequently, they might want Washington to push hard in mediating between Jerusalem and Damascus. And of course, no peace deal was viable, and what the US decided to do instead was to just attempt to overthrow Syria militarily by proxy and then directly. They failed in both counts. This paper talked about funding and backing groups recognized by the State Department as terrorist organizations. There was one organization, the Mujahideen al-Khaliq, MEK, that had been a U.S. State Department listed terrorist organization. There was a lobbying group, an MEK lobbying group that pretended to fight against this listing. There was this public theater where the lobbyists were begging the U.S. government to take them off the list, when in reality, the U.S. government wanted to use MEK as a armed proxy force against Iran, and they knew they had to take them off the terrorist list to do it more openly. That's what that was all about. So again, people always cite different lobbying groups in Washington as evidence that some outside source is exerting control over Washington, when in reality it's all part of a modern day empire. That is the imperial court at work. And it's also part of shaping public opinion. Them discussing the use of a US listed terrorist organization that had killed Americans in the past proves that US policymakers are willing to use terrorist groups to advance their foreign policy objectives. So this was written in 2009 when the US was arming and backing Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. That should not have shocked anybody. If they had read this paper back when it was published in 2009, they would know that that was considered a viable option by US policymakers. That's why I'm pointing this out. we see the United States building its military presence up in the Middle East right now. We understand by reading the 2009 Brookings Institution paper, which Path to Persia, that the U.S. clearly desperately seeks war with Iran. Iran has been evading U.S. efforts to trigger a war for years and years now. They understand that they're out of time, so they are going to attempt to provoke Iran, and I believe that if Iran refuses to be provoked, they may go ahead with it anyway. They're completely out of time. We've talked about this in regards to Russia, regarding Ukraine. We see how desperate the U.S. has acted in Eastern Europe, and we see how desperate they're acting in Asia Pacific to provoke a war with China over Taiwan. These three focal points we need to keep an eye on, and in regards to Israel and its military operations against Gaza, this is a blatant provocation being used to attempt to draw in the region, and specifically Iran. This military buildup is admittedly for dealing with Iran. They're attempting to make Iran look like the provocateur, the aggressor, when in reality these policy papers all the way back from 2009 admit that the U.S. is the one trying to provoke conflict and then make the world think it was Iran. So let's all keep that in mind as we move forward. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work, especially on Telegram. Everything goes there. I back up all my videos on Telegram. I publish all my articles, links to my articles there that might not even be allowed to be shared on YouTube or Twitter. Check the video description below for all of the links that I just referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it. It's not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been supporting my work, whether it's one-time donations, month-to-month donations, or even if you're just helping share my work with others to get the word out there, that is all greatly appreciated. I could not do this work without that support, so thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.